I'm super excited that we have Bob Maughon here as our keynote speaker. Bob's a super incisive, thoughtful, careful observer of the industry, in addition to being, of course, an amazing leader in the business itself. We first had Bob as our keynote speaker for 2020, which is when we were relaunching FlexPO Plus. And of course, COVID upended the plans, but Bob very kindly agreed to do a digital recording as was the thing that we were doing in those days. And I really enjoyed the conversation. It's up on YouTube, by the way, if you want to go take a look at it. But one of the things that, and I was telling this to Bob, one of the things that I never forgot from that conversation was we were getting into COVID after a very challenging time in the polymers and plastics industry, where it was very difficult to convince anybody about the benefits that plastics and polymers brought to our lives. The entire focus was on the plastic waste in the oceans, which admittedly is an important problem to solve. The entire issue was around the economic and the environmental and sustainability impacts of polymers and plastics. But COVID obviously changed a lot of those things, and Bob summarized it very succinctly when he said that COVID has changed the has clarified the value proposition of plastics for us. And it's a great conversation, so you should take a look at it. We tried to get Bob again last year, we couldn't, but so we are very grateful that he is here today. Bob obviously has an amazing background. You can look his resume up. I won't go through that. You're going to hear him in person in a few minutes. So with that, maybe we'll get started. And Bob, I'd like to invite you up here.
Great, thanks. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to see mostly my old Dow colleagues, so that's always the benefit of these events, is to get to catch up with people from the past. Yeah, I think back to that session, I think where we were recording and I was sitting, probably with a suit jacket on and pajama bottoms on, I think, when we did that recording. But I think it's not that we look back on COVID as a fond time, but I do think it did clarify the value proposition. I think my favorite example of that, because my kids are all focused on environmentally friendly products, which I think is great. But I remember going to the grocery store in the early part of 2020 and the end of first quarter, and in the cleaning aisle, right, which is to me the most solidifying moment, was when all the cleaning products were gone except for the ones that listed green labeling or environmentally friendly cleaning products, and that whole section was full. And nobody was taking those. So I think there was a point where I think a recognition that we want cleanliness, we want protection, we want health and safety, and we're willing to pay a price for that. But at the end, we still have to address this plastic issue. And I think that's, to the dialogue that we had, I think that issue hasn't gone away, but an understanding of the value, which gives us an opportunity in the market to talk about our products and actually provide solutions and be part of the dialogue. Because I would say back in 19 to 2020, we were not really in the dialogue around the future of plastics, and I think that's changed significantly. What I want to do, and I'll try to do this, in 30 minutes or so, is just give a perspective on what I see happening in the chemical industry, in the marketplace. Some things that are technology related and sustainability related, some things that are more market and supply chain related, and from that kind of shift to how we're looking at it and what we're doing from a SABIC perspective in the portfolio, but then hopefully we just lead to a discussion that we can have, as well. But I want to start with this because I think it's sort of a way to ground us when people say that the industry isn't that disrupted. I like this kind of approach because it just sort of simplifies it. So this is the top 20 global chemical producers in 2000. So 21 years ago, what did it look like? And if you just go forward, this is what it looks like. It looks like you took the animation out of the slides.
Okay.
So that's going to make this a little bit tricky, but
okay.
But if you look at it today, only 5 of these original companies, so Dow, Exxon, BASF, Sumitomo Mitsubishi, I think the only 5 that are left on that original list. So a significant change if you look today. And if you look today, those 5 are there. There's obviously 15 new entrants. 5 of those new 15 entrants are from China and Taiwan. And those are in the top right. So PetroChina, Wanhua, Hengli, Sinopec, obviously Formosa. You included Reliance in that group from the emerging national oil sort of grouping of companies. So a significant change in who's left and what's happened to the marketplace. And even the companies that are left are fundamentally different than they were in 2000. I think Dow was an example, right? Went through a massive merge and spin and really became a new company in its focus. BASF has gone through significant change. Exxon is integrated refining and chemicals and is moving in a direction in that space. So a lot of change to this group. And if I look at sort of what I see as sort of the megatrends and accelerators, I would say one is deglobalization or globalization. We'll talk a bit about that and which is it? Are we moving in a globalized way or a deglobalized way? I think that's a complicated topic. The China industry transition, and you saw the 5 entrants from China and Taiwan in the list. Look, I think it's not just the growth of those companies, the competitive dynamic in China is fundamentally changing. Sustainability and the energy transition, maybe if I take those two together, is really a question of, obviously a focus on decarbonization, a focus on the energy transition, but also energy security. And I think, if you look at accelerators, the Ukraine situation had a significant impact on the energy security question, but I'm not sure energy transition and security are that decoupled. I mean, I think at the end you're going to see that accelerating the path, especially in Europe, but globally, and with the IRA here in the U.S. And then, the growth of new exponential technologies that have an ability to disrupt the markets that we're in. And the question really for companies, and if you go back to that 2000 versus 2020 picture is, again, 75% of those companies are not in the top 20 anymore because they didn't adapt and thrive through that transition that happened over the last 20 years. And I think the question for us, in the industry is, what does it take to survive over the next 20 years? When I look at this first question on globalization, deglobalization, I'd say that, the way we look at it from a SABIC perspective is sort of around 4 key pillars, right? There's the US, China. You can use whatever term you want. I think our strategy folks use the word spat. I think that's a simplistic way of describing it. But I mean, we obviously have a fight for fair trade and for technology leadership in the US. There's clearly a focus on self-reliance and driving their own path on trade, sustainability in China. EU is clearly pushing for sustainability, but also looking at it for competitive advantage and potentially barriers to entry in their marketplace, right? And CBAM, I think, being a good example of the impacts of that. And then you see, I'd say the rest of Asia, right? Seeing an opportunity to be a champion of trade with low barriers within the Asian countries for trade and facilitating also the support for growth in China as well. So you see a complex dynamic, and from an innovation perspective, it doesn't necessarily have a huge, necessarily direct impact on us, but I do think for companies that are primarily looking at export as a way to drive their growth, and I would take the U.S. as an example of companies that are taking advantage of low-cost gas in the U.S. for growth. If I take KSA as another example of building off the low-cost liquid feedstocks in the kingdom, you need to understand this dynamic because growth is going to happen in areas like China and Asia, but do you have the positioning with your products, your assets, your supply chain, and your barriers to entry removed to be able to participate in the way that you used to in those markets? I don't think you'll be able to participate in the way that you used to be able to participate. And on that, I'll just highlight this. I mean, if you look at China on the left-hand side, so this plot just shows the demand versus the absolute demand growth, so the demand CAGR versus the growth, and you see the size of the China bucket, right, of up to 2030, 50 million tons of growth. And you see the amount of that's really, the orange being the import, right? You see the large expectation of self-sufficient growth in China that they're expecting to have. You see India, obviously, with a much larger balance and some of the other countries, but a clear recognition that China will grow, that it's clearly going to still have significant imports, but it's clearly going to be driving towards self-sufficiency. And If you look at the competitive structure, and I think this is also an interesting dynamic, whereas in 2000 it was pretty much all state-owned enterprise, that balance in 25 is going to be very different. The balance of Chinese private chemical companies, the international chemical companies that are also coming in, the ability to come in internationally with wholly owned assets is now there, which we are doing, BASF and others. So not only is China focusing on self-sufficiency, but it's creating a much more competitive and challenging economic environment to compete in China. And that means export, from an export model perspective, if you're looking to grow, that's not necessarily going to be the most attractive market to do that in. So just a recognition of that. Sustainability, I think I don't want to dwell on this. We talked a lot about this previously on the COVID topic and others, but the pressures have only increased since we've talked about these issues, whether it's the consumer NGO pressure, that really was the catalyst for driving the initial actions. The brand owners clearly extremely exposed, setting targets, as many of you know, setting targets that don't have technology solutions to deliver on those targets today, but increased pressure to deliver. A regulatory environment that is rapidly changing, whether it's circularity or emissions targets globally, whether it's the EU Green New Deal, whether it's the launch of CBAM, which is now rolled out, although not for the chemicals chain yet, but coming. You look at maybe more positive approaches versus the EU Green New Deal, and I think a big discussion at Davos is the EU model of regulatory pressure and tax the right approach, or is the US approach of incentivization through the IRA, is that a better model? But I think you're going to see a play out of which approach is going to win long term. Even in KSA, like we've been under a massive pressure on energy efficiency, held to certain benchmarks, and having to drive multi-billion-dollar capital investments to drive energy efficiency. Most of the countries delivering on either 2050, 2060, or 2070 carbon neutrality targets. For those that have been engaged, the UNEA plastic instrument negotiations although I think we'll end in a logical place, will have profound impact on pressure around additives, around recycling levels and commitments. And you see companies like SABIC, like Dow, like Lyondell, making considerable volume commitments around recycling because of this pressure coming. And very clear, for those that haven't been involved in the UNEA discussions, when you talk to Inger, who's the director from the UN, who's really responsible for that. I mean, she thinks as an economist, and so the usual response we give on, why we can't have greater recycled content is, the availability of waste, and we need to make sure that whatever targets we have are tied to the availability of waste and the value of that waste, so that we can recycle it. And her comment is, she looks at it very simply, which is, yeah, but the easiest way for me to raise the value of the waste is for us to cap your production. So that's how they think about it. Because capping production is a more direct approach to putting value in the waste. Now, I don't think that we'll likely end up with a global cap on production, but that's the position that they're coming into in the negotiations. So just recognize that's why the pressure is so great. And then beyond just these broader sustainability concerns, greater responsibility on ESG disclosures is clearly impacting, access to financial capital. I think we'll see how that whole scenario plays out. Certainly, integrated reporting of financial and non-financial disclosures is going to continue to happen. There's, I think a lot of work to clean up what reporting means, what the standards are, and how we're going to be evaluated. But it will impact access to capital. When you think about the energy transition and carbon neutrality, the sources of competitive advantage start to change. So, what used to be competitive advantage is, advantage feedstock, market proximity, and CapEx and process technology and access. And those things are still very important, but going forward, access to renewable resources, geological storage capacity, existing infrastructure to manage, pipelines, transmission lines, and supporting policies are going to be a big part of what enables which companies lead out of that transition. And also portfolios are going to change. And this just gives you a perspective, and I think this is IHS data, and S&P data, but if you just sort of look at, an assumption around the decarbonization proposals, what does 2050 look like? And you end up with a massive, if you think about CO2 as a product, a massive management of the CO2 and hydrogen is significant product portfolios. And how do we play in hydrogen as an industry, either as a purchaser or potentially investing and leading in hydrogen as a product is going to be a considerable strategic decision for companies to make. I won't be able to show this one, but I guess what I would say, because the animation isn't here, if you just ignore the left here, the other thing I'd like to make from a technology perspective is just, and whether you look at technology or you look at products, we haven't really innovated significantly since the 1980s. And I say that coming from multiple companies that have led in that transition, and I'm not going to pick on polyethylene. I mean, certainly solution polyethylene was a big enabling technology, but in general, we're making the same products with slight differences in polymer architecture. We're differentiating and providing value. But most of the products that our industry produced, whether it's methanol, ammonia, it's olefins, and even polyethylene, the bulk of those volumes are made with the basic same technologies that were invented between the 1920s and the 1970s. That's a considerable point of recognition of where our commoditization is in our space, and the barrier it is to innovate in those spaces. And again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but the reality is, if somebody from the 1940s came and looked at a cracker today, although the technology, the automation, the operation would be different, the basic technology is the same. If you look at how that plays out in our portfolios, what we've done on the right-hand side here is really focus on, okay, how do we move from products to application space? How do we get better at understanding markets? How do we get better at positioning our products for value and use in certain applications? How do we move from that to offering services, whether it's design for recycling or other solution sets? But we should just be clear that this is just an approach to slow the commoditization of these products. And I think a recognition, you can only capture so much value in the value chain for these materials, and this is the battle that is being waged. So I think as a recognition, we need to sort of recognize that innovation in our space, fundamental innovation, has slowed. And why is that happen? I mean, I think there are obvious reasons for it. I mean, one, look, we've had relatively stable challenges and opportunities for petrochemicals over that period of time. Availability of feedstock matching demand, stable, stable over that period. Energy prices, feedstock prices, mainly product demand growth rather than product displacement. So we weren't being disrupted in our chains. Continuous evolution helped maintain process fitness, and so the more efficient we got and the lower cost we made the manufacturing processes, the more difficult it is to replace them. This is a classic challenge in a commoditization space. Their assets are highly capital intensive and interconnected. And I use the example of our Jubail petrochemical complex that you could use the Lake Jackson Freeport footprint as well and see a very similar footprint. And on the scale piece, this is one of our modules for our joint venture with Exxon at GCGV. Now the construction is not the challenge. It's making sure the roadways are big enough for the equipment to get to where they need to go. The scale with which we're building these assets is at a point that it becomes very hard on a cost perspective to displace these technologies with anything else. And new technologies must offer a significant advantage. I mean, for those of you that have had a technology background, you've probably been in discussions where you're trying to argue you've got a 10% capital improvement in your technology versus existing assets. And somebody says, yeah, it's 10%, but the whole complex is $2 billion. You're saving me 10% on $100 million or on $500 million. I'm not willing to take that risk of putting the risk of the $2 billion investment in place. And these are good arguments, but the reality is it's why our industry hasn't fundamentally changed. From a disruptive technology or exponential technology perspective, just a few other things that have changed though, right? And I think that require us to take a step back and think about what we're doing. So, cost of renewable technology, right? If you look at the cost from 2010 to 2020 on cost of renewables, 7 times reduction in the cost of battery storage as well over that same period of time, significant reduction. But look at digital technology, the cost of memory, the cost of internet, radical reductions in cost. Even on biotech, and I'm not gonna get silly in this talk, going to focus on that piece, but as it relates to the cost of DNA sequencing, the cost of printing, the cost of these technology spaces, orders of magnitude reduction in the cost. And so it does lead to some additional disruptions, right? If you think about, also other catalytic forces, artificial intelligence, enabling the digital tech, distributed generation of power and renewables as an example, impacting how we use the power. and on biotech, new vehicles for delivery, for example. And so when you look at markets, right, the power market is clearly disrupted. The mobility market, and we'll talk about that, has been radically disrupted as well. Communications, and digital will, I think, have an impact on all markets in a form or another. And the same on healthcare and synthetic biology. So look, I think you're seeing changes in how many of these markets have made assumptions around technology and what that means for those markets for the future. And I'll use maybe just the auto as an example. I use Mercedes as an example. We could do this for any OEM at this point. But Mercedes said, if you look at where I've highlighted Mercedes in the middle there, by 2025 they'll offer an e-vehicle for every model that they serve, and they've have a backup that shows each of the models and the replacements. But the more important part is there's a complex architecture of chemical companies that are going to have to play a role in making that transition happen, whether it's the supply of the green electricity, whether it's the battery materials, the battery chemistry, the battery systems themselves, the charging stations, the battery recycling. There's a massive new market that's really grown that needs chemical materials, that needs our solutions to enable that. And if you get into, well, I'll get into a little bit later, even the housing of the battery packs and the material solutions that are needed there. So if you look at the announcements, right, whether it's 2035 in Europe where no more internal combustion engines will be produced, I think 2030 in the Netherlands, I think even heavy trucks now push to 2040 to 2045. So you're going to see massive transitions in these marketplaces, and it has a fundamental impact on what product solutions. If I think we list Albemarle there on battery materials, but I could easily put Johnson Matthey in the same place, and we know Johnson Matthey is a catalytic material supplier, but they've invested significantly in replacing their portfolio with growth in batteries as the significant opportunity for their segment. I mean, it's changing what portfolios are for a lot of these companies. So maybe I'll pivot a bit to talk a bit about how we're focused on innovation and sustainability, and then we can get into the dialogue. So the way we typically look at it from our perspective is we have three major business segments. I've excluded Hadid, which is our metals business. I think that's very much a localization play of steel in the kingdom. But from a petrochemicals perspective and agronutrients perspective, because we're one of the largest ammonia and urea producers as well, it's really in petrochemicals, it's how do you focus on product differentiation and from a cost and performance perspective, much like our competitors, and on driving differentiation in our market segments. On process, it's really around new process capability, cost and competency and process improvement. And our specialties business, which is a much more material differentiated portfolio, it's really around bringing technology as a way to provide unique market solutions in these high growth segments. But as a few examples of how we think about that, and I'll start with the right-hand side, from a chemical process innovation perspective. There are improvement projects, like many of you, and I'll highlight one. This is one we share with investors, but it's around things you do in your assets to improve overall efficiency, like many others, right? So, our butadiene extraction technology to debottleneck our plants, but also investing in new process and reactor technology. I highlight our Angevok technology here, which is for conversion of liquid feedstocks, whether that be pie oil or heavy liquids, with ethane in crackers to be able to co-feed and deliver unique solutions. I could have easily used the e-cracker technology or pie oil plastic recycling technologies here, but investing in new reactor designs to deliver fundamentally new approaches towards the products that we make. And we're willing to make those kind of bets. And then on the polymer side, improvement projects like, things like, mundane things like a dry catalyst feeder for technology feed is an example, but also investing in integrated new reactor designs for delivering on differentiated polyolefins and taking the risk to go into new spaces of hybrid solutions, in this case, which has both gas phase and slurry capability within the reactor design. But also segment-driven innovation now, and I'll, going back to the EV space, right? So taking a collaborative approach with the business to recognize, and we did this about 3 years ago, that EV was going to be a considerable opportunity and threat for our portfolio. And recognizing that 70% of the vehicles in production will be electrified as a target by 2030. Whether that's 70%, 50, or 30, the size of that market segment is massive. is also a kind of a funny debate we have with our Aramco colleagues as to what percentage of that is actually going to be true, but it doesn't really matter. Whether it's 30, 50, or 70, it's a massive amount of market opportunity. And there are huge needs in that space. Reduce cost, enhance safety and performance. I mean, I think we all see all the issues that have related to fires in recent weeks and months, whether it be on airplanes with battery packs or in automobiles, and then reduce environmental footprint. And we see a significant amount of volume potential of resin sales in this space. And so we've developed a portfolio of solutions from materials perspective with PP and our engineering plastic portfolio, with manufacturing those materials, with assembly of large part materials for encapsulation of the batteries, managing FR performance of those materials to make sure that we can meet the standards required for the OEMs, and then as well doing the application development and solutions development with customers. And we see, again, a significant portfolio of volume growth in a space that didn't really exist for us 3 to 4 years ago. And so from a summary, I mean, I think we have a strong portfolio. I mean, whether it's the patents or the number of projects and so forth, but I think, when you look at, where we are today, it's over half the products have an A+ or an A++ rating from a sustainability metric perspective. And we've driven a focus on improving the percentage of innovation EBITDA that's part of the business EBITDA, which is a big focus of how do we drive greater differentiation in the portfolio, but also making sure that the work that we're doing are aimed at these large strategic shifts in the economy, whether it's the net zero economy, where we're focusing on decarbonization and the transition to EV, whether it's the exabyte economy, where you're focusing on communications and materials that can enable better transmission, whether it's the circular economy and managing circularity of plastics, or whether it's the biogrowth economy, where we're focusing on either enhanced agronutrients that can either improve crop yield or reduce emissions, and also delivery of solutions into those market segments. But when we shift to carbon neutrality, and I think will be probably a debate throughout the day, just highlight for you kind of where we are in that space. So we've committed, like most of our peers, to a 2050 target on carbon neutrality. That requires a 20% reduction by 2030 in our state versus our 2018 baseline. We're about halfway to that target today, so I can go through a bit of that, but on a good path. And obviously on Scope 3, we're committed to working with our value chain to deliver the reductions in Scope 3, and I can talk more in the Q&A about that as well. But we have a tendency to make this topic very complex when we talk to others about it, but it's really for our industry fairly straightforward. I mean, we about 80+% of our emissions come from heat used to drive our reactions. They don't come from byproducts or CO2 that's a stoichiometric waste out of our portfolio, with the exception of a few cases. And so you need to find a way to generate heat differently. Now, the first bucket is, I think, what we all have been doing, right, which is driving reliability, energy efficiency, and improvements in our assets. And in our portfolio, we think we can get about 20% of our emission reduction that way. I mean, I think that's classic work that most of us are doing. But the rest come from purchasing renewable energy, from electrifying our assets, from doing carbon capture, and then leveraging hydrogen as appropriate to close the gaps along with carbon capture. And the balance of those depend a lot on the geology of the area where your assets are, on the access to feedstocks in those regions, the access to power and infrastructure in those regions. But when our CEO says, yeah, but what's the fourth or fifth sort of way we're going to approach solving this? What's the new breakthrough way? I have to remind him every time it's just heat. We may come up with very unique ways to deliver the heat, but at the end, it's not more complicated than that. I'll skip the 2030 one just to say that we're about half of the way there at this point, and we are taking some steps that are more substantial along that path. So we are investing with the Saudi government on a large carbon capture hub in the kingdom. We will deliver several million tons of CO2 reductions before 2030 from that hub. So that'll be at least our first opportunity to demonstrate that at scale. We are demonstrating with BASF and Linde the e-furnace, which will be operational this year and allow us, as you'll see, to put the first commercial furnace in prior to 2030. And that's already slated, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And then obviously increasing our renewable energy purchases and efficiency and hydrogen investments as well. And I'll just pivot it to this point. I think the bigger question is how you get from 2030 to 2050, and our view is you're not going to get there by optimizing from now till 2030 and coming up with the perfect solution and then deciding to go implement that solution all at once. We're going to have to go make those investments now. So we have a first adopter program within the company to demonstrate hydrogen combustion, furnace electrification, and CO2 capture from the flue gas. We maybe debate with some, the economics of these actually, depending on your geography and your access, are actually not that different. But the needs from an infrastructure perspective and the capability to deliver those things and the risk are different between the different options. And so, although we're demonstrating the demo, for example, on furnace electrification with BASF and operating that this year at their site in Ludwigshafen, we will take that and demonstrate that in 2027 as a target in a full-scale furnace implementation. Linde will have the technology packages ready in 24, so it's really just a process of doing the feed and full engineering for that scale up. We'll be able to do CO2 capture from the flue gas before that, as well as hydrogen. And the CO2 capture one will require us to have the large hub in KSA to do the capture, but that's already in place and the CapEx is underway. And on the hydrogen one, I think a more straightforward implementation. But the point is, and we've selected the assets where these will go. So I think that's another point of the journey, right? Which is we're committed to putting these in commercial assets within KSA and outside of KSA with a clear execution plan, because we want to be ready by 2030 to roll out the best set of solutions in each of the regions based on how the performance of these three. On our circular journey, I typically show a slide on True Circle, which is our version of kind of the holistic set of solutions. Many other companies have a similar sort of approach, but I just wanted to maybe walk through the history a little bit. We started with mass balance and chain of custody back in 2014 with getting certified and doing that with our bio-based materials, so certified renewable PE and PP, designed for recycling in 2019. But we also launched the first advanced recycling or chemical recycling solutions in 2019. So we took the risk to take pie-oil and put it in our cracker, blended at a low level, and demonstrated the volume so that we could sell product on the market, which has been hugely successful for us. And you can deliver that to market with a premium and get the value for it. So I think that's a clear point. We broadened our certified renewable materials in 2019. In 2020, we started launching closed loop solutions with our customers. So here, trying to manage the stream of plastic across the chain. It's a good example here with Tesco and Bradbury's, but we have a host of these now. Moving towards ocean-bound and ocean-recovered plastic solutions from a mechanical and chemical recycling space. Launching PCR compounds, which we think obviously is going to be a significant part of the strategy going forward. But also investing in technologies like blockchain from a certification and tracking of the material through the chain, because we think that that's going to be a critical piece for customers as we go forward to have confidence and assurance on those recycled materials and the content of the products. So we've taken little steps of risk along the way. It's not like you come with a pure strategy that takes 5 years to develop and then you come out and launch it. We didn't know that we would get the value for the chemical recycled products in 2019. We had a hope from the customers, we had buy-in to validate, but we took the risk. And I think that's a bit of what I want people to leave this with, is we're going to all have to take some calculated risks in our assets that we're not used to taking, because you're not going to get a perfect business case and value prop on a theoretical business proposal. You're going to have to demonstrate these materials and you're going to have to take them to market. Where we are on that journey, we did the foundation in 2019. We'll be operational this year with our facility in Helene that'll produce around 20 kilotons of pie-oil and hydrotreat it, so with Ultratop-SO and Plastic Energy. And we have approval to proceed with a 200 kiloton facility in that 25-26 time period. But we've also committed a 1 million ton target. Now, every company's got its own version of the amount of recycled content that they're proposing by 2030. We've targeted 1 million because I think to us it needs to be very clear that we're taking real stepwise capital investments, and whether the number becomes 3 million next year or larger in 25, to me what's more important is we deliver the facility in Europe today and we deliver the facility in 25-26 at the 200 kiloton. That's the more important metric, but full commitment to do so. And lastly, I'll just finish on the collaboration piece. this is a new dynamic that we're in, right? I mean, whether it's the focus on external reporting and the level of ESG disclosure and evaluation and rating that we're exposed to now, whether it's the number of initiatives in our value chains that we operate in today, or with our peers, whether it's the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, Operation Clean Sweep, the World Economic Forum, where we're very engaged on low carbon emitting technologies, things like Cyclics, like Holy Grail. These are all critical initiatives for us to be engaged in. But also as a value chain, it's very important that we're working very effectively with our peer groups on how we position the work that we're doing, whether it's through GPCA, World Plastic Council, WBCSD, and others. I think more than ever, we're at a space where our industry needs to be collaborating together than in the past, and taking some risk together in projects, sharing IP and sharing risk. We would have probably not done a project like the BSF and Lindy project on the e-furnace 5 to 10 years ago, but it's a clear recognition if we want to move fast, we're going to have to do this in targeted ways with partners. So with that, I will finish and leave it to our discussion, I guess, and questions.
Sounds good.